Hi there. Today we're talking about Zero Trust architecture. A lot of organizations will be talking to you about Zero Trust. Many of them will be saying to you, just use their product for Zero Trust. But we all know that doing a single product Zero Trust implementation is simply not compliant with principles. Zero Trust always requires multiple mechanisms. Otherwise, you are putting too much implicit trust in each mechanism. Now, there are three primary mechanisms people are looking at to do Zero Trust: EDR, logging or SIEM, or NDR. Which should you do? Well, let's look at EDR. EDR is a great technology. You can actually use it, run agents on your endpoints, and detect threats. Logging is supported by most environments. So is logging and EDR the right way to go? Not all endpoints will actually support EDR agents. BYOD, for example, mainframes, NAS arrays, all of these things contain sensitive data and need to be part of your Zero Trust. So what about logging? The problem with logging is that logging is mutable. You cannot trust logging from a compromised endpoint. We saw this with the SolarWinds breach. The first thing the attacker did was turn off logging. What I want to talk to you today is about doing NDR, network detection and response. The combination of EDR, NDR, and logging forms a very powerful triad of controls. NDR is supported across all devices: IoT, OT, ICS, SCADA, mainframe, office automation, HVAC. All of these are supported by NDR. And in fact, NDR can be supported across on-prem, public cloud, and private cloud. It's quick to deploy with Gigamon's deep observability and can cover the entire infrastructure. So what do the standards say? NIST SP 800 207, for example, has section 3.4.1, which says the enterprise must record data across the network. That's NDR. What about the CISA maturity model? The CISA maturity model has a whole pillar, which is the network and environment pillar, that requires threat detection on the network. These standards are saying do NDR. So am I actually saying you need to just do NDR? No, of course I'm not. I'm saying the correct combination is NDR and EDR and logging. That will result in a capable, deployable, scalable, and mature Zero Trust architecture. Thank you very much.
Hello to everyone out there. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today in our conversation on successfully implementing Zero Trust. Writer William Gibson coined the phrase cyberspace. He supposedly coined the saying, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet." Well, in this presentation, Ian and I are going to talk about how the future is indeed here and how so many organizations see the need for Zero Trust, but they don't see how they can implement it. We're going to do a deep dive in how having deep observability into the entire network, whether it be on-prem, physical networks, virtual networks, whatever it might be, is critical. We're also going to talk about how network segmentation is required, but how you also must not have disruption or loss of visibility. And then finally, we're going to talk about the need for the capability to observe bad actors within the network. We're going to talk about which bad actors those are in the controls. But first, before we do so, before we get started, I want to introduce you to Ian Farquhar, Gigamon's acting CISO.
Hi there. Thank you, Matthew. Yes, I am Gigamon's acting CISO. When I am not doing that, I'm also the director of the security architecture team here at Gigamon. I've been working in InfoSec for 30 years, which hurts a little bit to say, I've got to say. Previously, I was at RSA. I did security consulting for customers all over the world at Cisco, writing security architecture reviews. At Sun Microsystems, I was in the network security group at Sun, doing policy, doing incident response, doing multiple things to protect the company. Silicon Graphics, Cray Research, and at Macquarie University, even though the CISO title didn't exist, I was the security officer for the entire campus and also was a security researcher at Macquarie. How about you, Matthew? What's your background?
Yeah, so hello again, everybody. I'm Matthew Plummer. I am the public sector CTO here at Gigamon. And over the past 25 years, I've been providing guidance, learned in various disciplines. So early on, my career was with the federal government. It's technology regulators, working with defense contractors who support federal enterprises. And then, a lot of work within the national cyber defense space. I continue to work adjacent to those today. Moved more into the commercial and academia and financial industries. But today, I look forward to talking about and discussing Zero Trust with all of you. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, let's jump into the presentation.
So, Zero Trust. One of the things that's really annoying for me is that a lot of people leap on Zero Trust as if it's a product or a feature. And Zero Trust is just simply not a product or a feature. Now,
No,
the
not.
concept has actually been around for 10 years at least. 12 actually, John Kindervag, 2010. But if you talk to particularly the people that Matthew and I talk to in defense, they'll tell you that the concepts has been around for many, many years. And in reality, it's a formalization of a lot of things that were happening. Matthew, why do you think it's really got currency at the moment? Why do you think Zero Trust is interesting so many organizations, particularly in US federal?
Yeah, so you are correct. Zero Trust has been out there for a while, and we are hearing it all over the place. We're seeing for the first time Zero Trust conferences that are designed for only Zero Trust, and quite frankly, we're hearing a lot of chatter on how you implement Zero Trust. But the main reason that Zero Trust is really, I think, taking off, specifically to this document, the NIST 800-207, for me, is that it's providing you a high-level direction. It's giving you a way to understand what's happening, what you need to do to start to get to the Zero Trust environment, what resources you might need to bring into the picture, and it's not, this document's not the answer key. It's definitely not the answer key. There is no document out there that tells you you have to buy certain applications and you'll get that. You hear it all the time. It's a journey. Well, it definitely is. But what it's doing is allowing for companies and agencies to prevent breaches. You're looking at different ways to control access. We're going to talk about having access to the front door. If we can stop the consistent access to all the applications, and we require users to re-authenticate, we're in essence, we're stopping and we're preventing the breach at the root. And that's what I think this document and why people are really starting to gravitate towards it today.
Yeah, when I look at NIST SP 800-207, what I see is a definitional document. And
Yes.
the document's quite clear about that. This is not an architectural design. This is not a blueprint for implementing a Zero Trust architecture.
That's right.
This defines what Zero Trust actually is. And it does it in a fairly elegant and simple way. And we'll come to, in fact, one of the examples they use shortly to describe what it is. But I seriously think everybody should be reading this. It's not a particularly long document, but it does cover many of the things you need to understand why this is a really cool concept and why the US government has committed so heavily to it. In fact, I think that's been a surprise to a lot of people that the US government did commit to it via Executive Order 14028 and the other documents we're going to be considering in this talk. It's because they were looking at the current state of cybersecurity. They were looking at the fact that we have still issues in 2022 that we don't have great solutions for, and looking at the available options and realizing that Zero Trust is the best option to address those, the best option to protecting our sensitive data, our people, and our environments from malicious threat actors.
That's
So
right.
with that, let's go to the next slide, where we make an analogy, and it's around the concept of implicit trust. And implicit trust is really the core of this document. And I can actually talk about this because I have in my life, I've had the experience of getting on a lot of planes, and I'm sure it's like a lot of you. And one thing that happens is the first time I ever flew, I was actually 4. And the process was fairly simple. I presented a ticket and I got on a plane. No one screened my bags. No one looked at an ID. I was just allowed on the plane. It was 1970. And then through the 70s, we had a series of hijackings and bombings, and they introduced the concept of airport security. Now, NIST SP 800-207 uses this as an example for how it works. So let's just drill into that very, very quickly. You get on a modern plane. What do? You approach a security screening point. That security screening point makes you present ID. They determine that you are the person who is authorized to get on the plane. They scan your bags, x-ray it, put you through a body scanner, assess your trustability, assess the risk you might pose. And if you are assessed as trustable enough, you are allowed through to what airports typically call the sterile zone, which Zero Trust would call the implicit trust zone, and are allowed to board the plane. If you fail your identity check, if you're on a no-fly list, if you are carrying stuff that you are not allowed to be carrying, you are turned around. You're not getting on that plane. That is very much like the concept of Zero Trust. Let's go and look now at what Zero Trust means in the actual standard itself. Matthew, do you want to run through this part?
Yeah, I do. And that was a great example. If you think about everything Ian was just giving as the example of going through security, what we've done and what Zero Trust has done, and specifically this document, the SP 800-207, is it's implementing a policy decision and enforcement point. And you might be saying to yourself, okay, well, we've done that. We have them log in and we verify their credentials. Well, this is doing something a little bit more than logging in and letting them go into the Wild West, right? So the policy decision point is really looking at your identity, understanding what you have access to see, what you have access to get into. And it makes the call, right? So if you think about Ian's a point where they've gone through the first checkpoint, what we've done is we've let you log in. You've gotten to the decision point. It's now saying you have access to these files. You now are in the what Ian was commenting on, the sterile zone, where you have access to the environment where you've been able to use. But there's more to it than that, because you now have to have a system that's looking at what you're doing within those specific areas. Are you able to log into a specific environment and download lots of data? Well, the decision and enforcement point needs to look at that and say, wait a minute, is this user supposed to be doing this? And if not, it needs to then take away that permission to your access and be looked at. And that's the biggest piece of what they're continually looking at here, is that implicit trust zone. Are you providing implicit trust to the environment?
To me, the core of Zero Trust is actually around this concept of implicit trust. And
Correct.
What that actually means is trust that is granted without a rational reason for doing so. And traditionally, our InfoSec architectures have contained a lot of implicit trust. The classic example and low-hanging fruit example is the idea that we trust people on the inside of the firewall more than on the outside. That's an implied trust. I can have insider threats on the inside. I can get malware or remote access toolkit on the inside, and I can use that implicit trust against the organization. By moving away from implicit trust and moving to measured trust is what we're trying to do. The other thing we're trying to get away from is the idea of trust being a single point in time. When you log in, as Matthew said before, you log in with a password and maybe you have a token or a cat card or something like that. That grants you a whole bunch of implicit trust. That's not reassessed until you log out or have another authentication mechanism. What we want to do is turn trustability into a constantly measured thing. So I have to keep asserting that that I am still trustable. And let's use an example, for example, of ransomware. Ransomware, again, shouldn't be a thing in 2022.
It really shouldn't. It really shouldn't.
Yeah. So somehow a user who has credentials and access to sensitive data installs some sort of malware. That malware operates as their identity. It accesses all the sensitive data and either does file locking, which is a lot less scary than the alternative, which is exfiltration or extortion. Think about it in terms of normal usage of the network. If that person is, say, an accountant sitting on a finance workstation, then accessing normal accounting systems is normal behavior. But if they are running through every file share in the organization and sending it outside, that's totally atypical behavior. The policy enforcement point would start to notice this extremely atypical behavior. The risk of that individual would increase and they would be blocked, preventing that exfiltration probably fairly quickly. That's the core of how this would affect it. But it's not just ransomware, it's also insider threats. It's also a whole bunch of risks. And that's why the US government looked at this and went, this is the way forward.
So Ian,
now, many organizations are looking at this outside of the US government too, and we're going to be talking to those in this talk. Matthew, let's look next at what this actually means, because this is a really basic concept. What would it actually look like in practice?
Right. So just to conclude something, and it comes into this slide here, if a user's credentials were taken, if somebody has gotten my username and password and came into the system, I had this conversation and someone said, well, there'll be a log for that. And my question was, why would there be a log created for a user logging into the system that wasn't supposed to be in the system if they had my credentials? Because they inherently are allowed into all of the pieces that I would have access to. So the thought process here is, how do we create an environment that's going to look at what happens when a user who's not supposed to be in the system gains access? We said just a little while ago that the NIST SP 800-207 is creating a document that it's not a blueprint of what you need to do, of exactly what you're going to do. It's a document that is conceptual. It's a design that you can apply to reduce risk in a measurable way. And what it's doing is on the screen here. It's giving you the building blocks, the pieces that you really need to implement to have a successful zero trust architecture. If you think about the moat security in the past, you had a lot of different security within the corporation. Your network was secure. The computers that were inside your building were secure. If anyone outside was connecting, they were connecting over a VPN, virtual private network. And you could say to yourself, CISO could say, we're secure. But enter today's modern technologies, where you have devices that belong to your employees. You have outside contractors. You have corporate systems. You have systems that are outside of the corporation, all having to connect into this environment. And the question I ask myself immediately is, how do I reduce that threat surface? Well, it goes back to what Ian and I were just speaking to around policy detection point. You have to have that policy engine that's going to set the parameters of what you're going to allow, what's going to be going on within it. You have to have that policy enforcement point. And then within that, obviously, you're going to have all the subsistence systems that are connecting in with the SIM and the data policy and everything else. What do you think about that, Ian?
I totally agree with you there. This slide really is core to me because it shows the concept of a policy engine that's performing risk evaluation of subjects. Those are the users of the systems, including things like the system posture, whether it's patched up to date, what that system is doing, whether it's behaving strangely because it's running malware. Everything is passing through some sort of policy enforcement access control mechanism before it's allowed to access the enterprise resources. But how does the policy engine evaluate risk? Well, bear in mind, NIST SP 800-207 is a US government document, tends to use US government terminology. So you have CDM. Now, those in the US government will know exactly what a continuous diagnostic and mitigation project system is. But outside, for those outside, it's essentially an environmental monitoring system, looking at the networks, looking at the endpoints, looking at the organization and understanding what it's doing. You are looking at logs, both via a SIEM, also just via other logs that are coming in. You are looking at threat intelligence. You are looking at the identity management system telling us who the subject is. You are looking at PKI because everything is meant to be encrypted. So you are looking at the fact that certificates are being presented properly. All of this data is being fed into the policy engine, and the policy engine is tracking subjects and systems and resources and constantly evaluating the risk. Sorry, go ahead, Matthew.
Is it safe to say, Ian, that it's increasing the visibility into the federal cybersecurity posture? I mean, is that safe to say? Okay.
Absolutely safe to say.
Because everything you just said with reducing threat surface and looking at the posture, those are the pieces, to me, the building blocks that are creating the boundary, the new moat, if you will, and if that's even a term, on what this document is creating.
I love to look at real castles. You know, we've been talking about castle moat security for decades, and then we started to call it north-south security because we all said we weren't going to do castle moat anymore or perimeter security, and now we're calling it north-south. But fundamentally, we're just giving it different names and still saying we're not going to do it. Zero Trust is, in fact, the first time we've said we're not going to do it, and this is actually how we're not going to do it. And one of the tenets that NIST SP 800-207 has is that network position provides no level of trustability. So I could deploy the same service internally or external to my corporate network environment, and I can, it's the same service. And wouldn't that have been incredible during COVID if we'd all been able to do that quickly? The idea is to drive implicit trust out. And how do we drive implicit trust out? By making sure, measuring trust, and then making a decision on every selection. That's the core of NIST SP 800-207. But then we move on to other documents. And NIST SP 800-207 came out a couple of years ago. There have been other documents that go into more detail. Now, the next document that goes into more detail came out of CISA, and it's the Zero Trust Maturity Model. It's based on SP 800-207, but it establishes 5 pillars. Matthew, do you want to run us through what those 5 pillars are?
Yeah, not a problem. So as you said, this is the 5 pillar. Some of you might be more accustomed to 7 pillars, and we can talk to that if you would like. In the questions, please write us a question. But within this, you have identity, devices. You have network and environment, which is specific to Gigamon. It's what we're most interested in. Application workloads and data. But what's really interesting is if you look at the very top, you have your foundation of Zero Trust that goes across all the pillars. And that's going to be your visibility and analytics. It's going to be your automation and orchestration, and your governance. And all of those together are what is creating the maturity model. So you can't just come in and say, okay, I'm going to just look at one pillar. Because of the foundation, because that you have visibility across and then the automation across and the governance. You start to look at all the different requirements within all 5 pillars here, or 7 pillars in the other model.
I totally agree. You know, when you're talking to some of the organizations that are building the initial pilots, they will talk about their coverage across the pillars. And that's something we're going to be talking about today, because your ability to cover all of the pillars increases the utility of this model. You can look at Zero Trust through one pillar. And that's what some of the early pilots kind of did. For example, they looked at Zero Trust through the concept of identity, because they were using a risk-based authentication engine as their policy engine, and that kind of works for a pilot, but it's actually not a proper Zero Trust. To do proper Zero Trust, you should be looking at trustability across all of the pillars:
Correct.
The identity trustability, the device trustability, the network trustability, the application and workload, and the data. The last one is probably going to be the hardest, to be perfectly honest. And by the way, yes, both Matthew and I have commented that this is a weird model because the foundation is the ceiling, but let's just go with it. There are other models. DIS's with its 7 pillars is another one, as Matthew mentioned before. But, you know, a lot of organizations, what they're doing at the moment is letting the US government go first, organizations outside the US government. The market dynamic we are seeing at the moment is that this is the model that they will be pursuing, the CISO maturity model. While DIS's is different, it's a little bit more complex and possibly a little bit harder to swallow, although I would argue it's actually a superior model. At the moment, this is what most people are focusing on. And as Gigamon's acting CISO, when I am looking at our Zero Trust plan, and yes, definitely, Gigamon is on the same journey. Of course, we're on the same journey. Every mature organization that I am talking to, my fellow CISOs, are on the same journey. In fact, 9 out of 10 of them are. They are moving and using this model. But what's really nice about this is that it drills down. It's not just conceptual, in that it starts to put a series of approaches. Now, Gigamon is a network company. We're going to focus on the network and environment pillar. Let's look at what this document says about things that it suggests you do as part of a Zero Trust implementation. And that's where we get to this table. Matthew, do you want to run through the top and the bottom parts of this table and, you know, describe what it's saying, particularly talk about the different maturity levels that are expected?
Right. So as Ian commented, because Gigamon is looking at network and environment pillar, this example is showing just that. And if you look at the top, you're going to see that you have 3 different traditional, advanced, and optimal. And what this is it's splitting it up into 3 different areas of where you sit within the model and runway, in my opinion. So within traditional, it's kind of where we are now. The advanced is the short term. DoD is saying this needs to be done by 2027. And then you have optimal. And optimal is where we really need to be. So if we're going to have it all accomplished and have that green check mark, we need to be optimal. So as we start to look down the functions of network and environment pillar, you're going to see the network segmentation, threat protection, and encryption. And if we start to look at, I would say, threat protection, and we look at traditional, you're gonna immediately notice that you're looking at traffic filtering, known threats. But if you jump all the way into optimal, you're going to notice that it's a lot different. We're going to now look at context-based signals, and again, that's where we need to be. Now, Ian, I'll let you describe why we have a solid line here, which is very interesting and actually very important.
Yeah, because the top part really are the approaches. The bottom parts really are the capabilities. So you do want to have a visibility and analytics capability. You do want to have an automation and orchestration capability, and something we should all be doing, and a lot of organizations don't, is then mapping everything back to a governance capability. But one of the things I really want to highlight here is you'll notice there is some inherent tension in this, and that's a strange thing to say. So let me describe what I mean by that. If I'm going to be doing encrypting almost everything, I still have to do threat protection. If I'm going to be segmenting the network, I've got to also be able to do threat detection on the network. Now, think about it in terms of segmentation. Segmentation, to me, is an interesting control because it's something we all should be doing, segmenting our network. It makes lateral movement by an attacker much, much harder. However, what it actually also does is it's hard to do. It introduces risk. I've done network segmentation projects. Forrester actually wrote a report recently where they said 11 out of the 14 segmentation projects they evaluated had actually failed because it's really hard to do. To understand the dynamic behavior of your network is really difficult, and it's often that you have things that happen very infrequently that are business critical, that if you mess up your segmentation plan, causes outages and business impact. But also, if you segment your network, then doing network visibility becomes harder because you've got a highly segmented network, at least without Gigamon. And if everything's encrypted, how do you see the threats traversing your environment if they're encrypted too? As you can see, there is some inherent tension in these three requirements. And that's kind of weird because all three of them are definitely best practice. And then down the bottom, we're saying you've got to have visibility and analytics. Okay. You've just undermined that with segmentation. You just made it difficult with encryption. What we have to do is achieve all of these things at the same time. And if you want to understand why Gigamon is so important to this, we can actually do that. Whereas a traditional network, you couldn't.
That's right. You won't lose visibility into your network. And that's really what you were just saying, because once, and you kind of beat me to it, once you've segmented, you've done segmentation, you are losing that visibility. And it becomes hard to monitor what's happening, specifically the east-west traffic.
Yeah. And if you're not monitoring east-west traffic, you're doing perimeter security.
That's
you're
right.
Doing castle mode. It's really funny that when I talk to a lot of CISOs, I will make that statement and they get kind of offended. But honestly, it is. If you have no visibility of east-west traffic, I would argue you are doing perimeter security. So there are many, many documents about zero trust that the US government is producing. And a lot of them, with a few of them as of the time of writing, are listed here. You can just search these. We can just quickly run through them. You know, you've got NIST SP 800-207. You've got the CISA document, of course, that is right down the bottom. But you've got the DISA one, the DoD, Zero Trust Reference Architecture. Executive Order 14028, M2131 is about improving security controls, particularly around logging. M2209 is a key document because it's starting to pre-position some controls around what a zero trust network will need to contain, similar, but very much based on the document, the CISA maturity model. And there's also a planning guide. Now, all of these are US government documents, but a lot of organizations worldwide are looking to these and following their guidance. Just Google these if you want to access them. So, Matthew, anything you want to say on these?
Yeah, just a couple things. So you definitely commented on the important ones that I thought. The 14028 is an important one, and I hope you agree with me, but it kind of got the ball rolling with zero trust. It put it into motion, in my opinion. Hopefully you agree with that.
Oh, totally. I think it was a shock for a lot of people too.
I agree. And then the other big one for me, and you mentioned it, 2209. You mentioned how it provided recommendations. I believe it was 19. I believe it was 19 recommendations. But what I really like about that document, very similar to what we've been talking about for most of the day here, is it provides you a model to get you the pieces you need, which is what you want. It's really laying the groundwork, laying the breadcrumbs, if you will. And those 19 recommendations are critical to your success of Zero Trust.
I totally agree. So here's the big question in the 8 minutes we have left of this session. And this is the question a lot of CTOs are asking. Honestly, I'm asking myself, where do we start? Where do we start? M2209, which Matthew just mentioned, is the US government's answer to where do we start? 19 different controls.
Right.
But I want to look at that, and I want to look at the standard. And both Matthew and I will come to this. When you are looking at the 5 pillars, you are looking at what we should be doing. Now, there are multiple ways you can actually do Zero Trust. And if you looked at M2209, one of the key things they do is they start with the endpoint detect and response, which would correspond to the device pillar. A lot of organizations already have a massive investment in SIEM and logging infrastructure. That would actually cross several of the pillars. And there's also looking at the network. Where do you actually start? And the reality is, and this will be the core thesis of this talk, is that it really isn't an or. Do I do EDR or NDR or SIEM? The actual answer is all of them. In fact, the primary question is, where do you start? And honestly, I think that varies per organization. But if you are saying, I am only doing EDR and that's all I'm going to do, you need to realize that you are putting a lot of implicit trust in EDR, and you're not actually complying with Zero Trust principles. You're putting far too much implicit trust in a single control. EDR can be violated, but let's dig into that a little bit more. Matthew, do you want to say anything on this triad?
I think between your light board and that explanation, we have hit it home.
Yep.
So
all of these are necessary. The question is, where do you start? Now, let's just look at some of the challenges of, for example, an EDR controller. First is a mainframe. You don't buy an IBM mainframe, beautiful pieces of hardware, because it doesn't contain sensitive data. They tend to be massively laden with sensitive data. And that's why we spend a huge amount of money on them. And so they obviously need to be part of our Zero Trust architecture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, most of them will log. Most of them won't run an EDR agent. Matthew, what about a NAS SAN? Do we expect to see sensitive data on a big enterprise NAS or SAN?
It's going to be heavy data. Probably not going to run an EDR. Probably not going to run an EDR, but it's going to be heavy with data, and that data is going to be sensitive.
Yep. What about IoT? And a lot of people say, oh, IoT doesn't matter. It doesn't have sensitive data, at which point I point to the office photocopier, which is just a computer with a scanner and a printer. And I've seen threat actors in office photocopiers because no one patches them. And they are often full of vulnerabilities. They're often printing sensitive data. What about the Internet of Medical Things? What about SCADA systems? What about industrial control systems that could control really, really dangerous industrial processes that could have kinetic consequential damage if violated? OT, building control systems, HVAC. Rob Joyce, former head of the NSA TAO, actually in a Wired article talked about the NSA's TAO, their attack organizations breaking into networks through HVAC systems. If you are ignoring anything on this screen, then you are not doing a Zero Trust architecture. You are implicitly trusting that in your environment. And that's a real problem. You can't do that. Now, the answer to that might be, that's fine. These systems will log. And the problem with that is that logging is a great technology. And the problem is it is inside the blast radius of an attacker. And I won't go into this. Some of you may have seen me talking about the log attack chain, but fundamentally, logging, and in fact any telemetry from inside the host becomes untrustable if that host is compromised. So if I actually have a host that has a threat actor in it, any logging that comes from inside that is suspect. In fact, in the SolarWinds breach, one of the first things the threat actors did once they gained access to the SolarWinds environment was that they turned off and cleared the event logs. That's in Mandiant's report. So where you have an active intruder in your network, inside a device, you can't trust the logs from that device, or indeed any other telemetry like agent-based EDR. Now, what's the solution? Well, Matthew, do you want to talk about this particular section of NIST SP 800-207?
Well, the solution is deep observability. And I hope that's where you were going with this, because when we look at industry, when we talk about observability, when we talk about what it really means, Ian and I have had a lot of conversations around telemetry, understanding what the telemetry is going to be and understanding the blast radius of an attacker. That's what we're really talking about when we start looking at this section. Is, you know, we don't implicitly trust anything, and if you don't entrust everything, then you're doing what's called zero trust. And we need to observe from the outside. We can't just trust everything. We can't just say everything that has come in is trusted, because otherwise you'll be compromised. And that's what I really believe this section is starting to talk to.
Absolutely. This is NIST SP 800-207 actually saying you need to observe the network. It is not enough just to use logs.
That's right.
It is not enough to take a telemetry from inside a workload. You have to look at the external behavior on the network of that workload. It's in the title, Network Requirements to Support Zero Trust Architecture. You record packets seen on the data plane. And what that is saying is, to do zero trust, you need to do deep observability. Now, I know a lot of people don't get what deep observability is. Deep observability is observing the behavior of an entity from its network behavior. So that's why I said before, it's not about doing EDR and SIEM, or EDR or SIEM or NDR. It's actually doing a lot of them because they cross-check each other. And what the really cool thing is that if I have an IoT device like the one sitting up on my wall, my smoke alarm here at home, it doesn't log. It can't run an EDR agent, but I can look at it from the outside. That office photocopier I can't run an EDR agent on. It might not log, but I can watch what it's doing on the network. Deep observability is an absolute requirement for zero trust. And that's not saying just do deep observability. It's saying do all three. That thing, that triad of EDR, NDR, and SIEM, which actually Gartner calls the soft triad, is essential to doing zero trust. If you are not looking at doing deep observability, I would argue you are not doing zero trust. And if you want evidence for that, just look at this SP 800-207. So this is our call to action. I've said it several times. Matthew, I'm going to throw to you.
I agree 100%. Call to action is to do all three. And if you do EDR, NDR, and SIEM, you will have a successful outcome, and you are operating in a zero trust environment. Now, we have an example of this on the next slide, where our case study, where Gigamon has been working with the U.S. Department of Defense, joined with NSA, Cyber Command, and DISA. We did a zero trust pilot and implementation. We were the first, and they were the first, to implement on all 5 or 7 pillars of the DISA model. And initially, what happened here was that they did a pilot, if you will, and they did not have network visibility. They decided that it was not essential in the beginning. And as we've been talking about all day today, it is critical to the success of your zero trust environment. But after a red team, it was determined that they absolutely needed to know what was happening with their environment, especially around east and west traffic. And Gigamon was inserted, and we showed visibility across the network in the environment. We met the requirements. And I think Ian just said it a few moments ago, but I'm going to say it again. Section 3.4.1 says that network visibility is not a precondition of security. It is also a precondition of zero trust. And with this pilot and what we've said, continually said today, we do believe that is critical to the success of a zero trust environment. Ian, anything to add to that?
Other than that sneeze, my apologies. No, look, absolutely. They didn't have network visibility. They didn't have deep observability. The project did not meet the security requirements. With the addition of it, it did. It really is that simple. So with that, we're going to say thank you very much for your time today. We are right up against time. Thank you for your attention, Matthew.
Thank you guys very much.
And with that, let's go to the Q&A session.